Hello, welcome to Read. Today I wanted to talk about The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was written by Oscar Wilde and was released in 1890. Dorian Gray is a character maybe like Hamlet that has definitely is a stable part of literature, but has certainly broadened and expanded beyond just the realms of literature and is very well known just in general everyday conversation as an archetype of vanity and of kind of wanting to preserve beauty at the cost of being a morally suspect human. So I really kind of debated whether or not I even wanted to make a video talking about it because everyone already knows about Dorian Gray. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it was because that I'm actually slightly critical of this book, or not critical in the sense that I feel like it failed, except in one particular area, which I'll kind of talk about. But just that one of the joys about reading, and especially reading classics, is that, like Harold Bloom talks about, you'll often be surprised at just how weird and unique they are, and how they're actually legit good books, not just sort of good because they're kind of historical, because they have historical importance. You know, yes, Moby Dick has historical importance, but you read it and you're just like, whoa, this is a damn fine book. However, I didn't really get that feeling when reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. Aside from the fact that everything was very on the nose, it was just that everything was very on the nose, but it wasn't necessarily the sort of I'm reading the origin of established tropes. It's not the Dune effect. It was really more that you would have these characters where we have Lord Henry Wotton. Our three core male characters are Lord Henry Wotton, the walking aphorism generator, Dorian Gray, our titular beautiful specimen, and Basil Hallward, the man who is responsible for painting the portrait, the to-be-cursed portrait. And there's a lot of kind of really pleasant homoeroticism that goes on between them. Nothing really very explicit, but Basil Hallward, to kind of tell me how it's pronounced. Basil very much loves Dorian Gray and is maybe Dorian is much more his friend than Basil is Dorian's friend, because early on, Dorian gets introduced through Basil to Lord Henry Wotton, who will just sit down and go on diatribes talking about how youth and beauty and splendor are the most important truths. And yeah, you will just get aphorism after aphorism, and even to a point where it does get self-referential. Dorian Gray at some point criticizes Henry Wotton kind of later to the end and says something along the lines of, you would sacrifice anybody for an epigraph, which is really, there are some takeaway lines. There is some good stuff in this book, but still my lingering sensation was just that I wasn't startled by the book. I was very just whelmed. I guess I was whelmed. I wasn't underwhelmed. I was like, yeah, this is it. This is The Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm actually reading the book. I feel like I'd absorbed most of it through cultural osmosis, or I guess memes, really, mimetically. And there really wasn't anything else in the book. But anyway, to give a little bit more structure and focus and to stop rambling, I'll just talk about the three areas that I really gravitated towards, that stood out to me, that didn't resonate with me. The first is that one of the really cool images from the book that I do not feel like was properly explored, or there wasn't really enough setup to give this reading enough validity, is this idea that the portrait was always pristine and the sins and the age always were on Dorian Gray, but because of this high culture's desire to sort of maintain beauty at any ethical or moral cost, everyone was sort of willing to ignore it. And yes, there are some things. So, for example, we do get some conversations from Henry Wotton, who talks about how crimes is something of the lower class, and it's much more artistic when somebody who's older, or when somebody who is of the aristocracy performs a crime, and therefore it's more morally acceptable. However, we really it is still very firmly it's just kind of too much of a stretch to really assume that Dorian Gray was always aging, because it actually does become part of a plot point that he is not aging when he is confronted by the brother of Sybil Vane, the woman who fell in love with him, and he fell in love with her, but after she became a bad actress because all she could think about was her love for him. Again, her surname is Vane, like, come on. Anyway, he kind of dismisses her very rudely, and then out of grief and despair she kills herself, Ophelia style, but not drowning. She sort of like takes some medicine or something or poison really that kills her. Again, kind of Hamlet-y. But anyway, in order to, her brother James Vane sort of swears vengeance on Dorian Gray, and then later on comes across him, and Dorian's like, oh no, it wasn't me, look, this happened 18 years ago, and I'm like not even 18 years old. So it's like, subtextually you can always do that, and I think that is a good reading. And the reason why you can give credence to that reading is that at the very end the portrait is as pristine as it always was, or I said it's as pristine as the day that it was painted, but I like to read it as being as pristine as it always was. And this aristocratic bias to maintain beauty in order to by ignoring kind of grievous sins is a really interesting idea, but unfortunately textually it just doesn't line up, because there are important plot points that rely on the fact that Dorian Gray actually is young and actually does look clean and pristine. That was the sort of only thing that I felt like Oscar Wilde didn't provide enough to set up that's a valid reading that way. The other area that I had a bit of a criticism with was that I had heard that this was a bit of an LGBT book. I know it's very early, and so it is hard to imagine that you're going to get any of the sort of sophistication that you would get later from someone like Isherwood, but I was at least excited to see a little bit of what happens. However, aside from the pleasant kind of three-way homoeroticism that is implied between our core trio, what I'm about to say is based on this premise. When Dorian Gray has killed Basil Hallward and needs to dispose of the body, he calls on a friend, Alan Campbell, who they were great friends. They were quite inseparable for some time, and then something happened and they sort of basically broke up, is what it implied. And then Alan Campbell is like, no, I'm not going to help you. And then Dorian Gray pulls out his trump card. He writes something on the paper, shows it to him. And then Alan Campbell is is swayed. He's convinced and says, okay, I will help you. What I'm about to say is based on the assumption that what was written on that piece of paper was that Dorian Gray was going to reveal that Alan Campbell was homosexual. And if you disagree with that reading, then just ignore everything I'm about to say, and you can probably even skip forward. But when I read that, it was one of those ideas that I was like, oh wow, it's very interesting to read a book where they're kind of bringing up and they are mentioning kind of homosexual relationships. However, I was just left with this lingering sadness of like, oh yeah, but the homosexual relationship is used as a plot point and basically convinces him that, hey, it would be better to be gay than it would be better to be known as an accomplice to murder than to be known as being gay. And I know that is an unfortunate truth, but when it's used as a plot point, unfortunately, Dorian Gray doesn't get any repercussions for that. It's not a subtle thing. It's just sort of like, it's there, but it's almost like what help does it do? Like, it's good that it is there, maybe because at least we're getting some mention of it, but it's just as a plot point to get Alan Campbell to help Dorian Gray in his malicious sins, and then nothing good works out for Alan Campbell either. He ends up becoming an opium addict and ends up dying. So it's just like, what the hell, I was kind of like, I was let down, even though I knew I shouldn't have expected too much. And obviously, in terms of LGBT literature, we're going to end up getting a lot more better stuff from, even though I haven't read it, I know that it is a big part of Proust. Man, oh my gosh, talk about talk about a classic book that I am excited to read. But anyway, I know that it is explored more in depth, and I know that it was too much of an ask to have an actual, subtle, interesting, nuanced view of a book from this era, but I was still disappointed nonetheless. I was like, this was touted as a really early example of an LGBT book, and at least it's more pleasant. He talks about how being kind of implicitly these implicit homoerotic relationships are kind of acceptable because Lord Henry Wotton is a very, he is married, but he very obviously doesn't love his wife, and he's kind of very open and adventurous. But yeah, it was just a buzzkill, to be honest. And again, if you disagree with the fact that that's what Dorian wrote, I understand that this whole section just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, that was, one other little thing was that in the middle of the book, Dorian ends up, when he sort of realizes what's going to happen, and he's sort of trying to psychologically deal with, or really repress, he's definitely not dealing with it, he's trying to psychologically repress the fact that his vanity caused Sybil Vane to kill herself. He ends up becoming he ends up becoming enamored with and learning about and studying the lives of other aristocracy, and gets interested in learning about, textiles, jewelry, fashion, and a bunch of other things. And there's just this long section that is like, I know that when people read Moby Dick and you get to the sections about like cytology and whale anatomy, that you can just be like, oh my god, but at least it kind of comes into play in the later chapters, where that's, they're talking about that because that's what the characters in Moby Dick are literally doing right now. In this, there's just this entire long chapter where Dorian Gray is listing and talking about examples when jewelry and fashion and carpentry and rugs and whatnot Oriental rugs were used in this aristocracy. And the overall sensation is that you're getting is just that he is kind of flooding himself with these thoughts of the higher up in order to ignore this base truth that is in front of him, which is that he is responsible for this woman's suicide. However, because none of it comes into play at all, you really just get this, you really just want to skim it, and you just want to say, blah, 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 blah. Dorian Gray got interested in this aristocracy bougie bullshit for a long time, and he just ignored the fact that he was responsible for the death of Sybil Vane for a couple of years. And that was all. And obviously that's an incredibly reductive way of doing it, but when you don't integrate it into the story, that was just the sensation that I have. I don't remember anything because it was never important. So yeah, that was because it never became important. But yeah, those were some of my main criticisms. Just to talk about, there are some, sometimes the Lord of the Epigraph or the epigram does come through, and there are some nice extracts. So of course there is, experience was of no ethical value. It was merely the name men gave to their mistakes. And also, death does not send heralds, is a really great one. There's a beautiful line when he is talking about when Dorian Gray is first enamored with Sybil Vane, and he says, because she performs Shakespeare, and she is playing like Juliet and Rosalind and so on, and he says, lips that Shakespeare taught to speak have whispered their secret in my ear, which is a lovely thing. And then there are moments when Dorian Gray looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful. So yeah, maybe that's another thing. That's another thing that contributes to the on the nose. It's almost like Oscar Wilde wanted to present this character of Dorian Gray while also presenting essays analyzing Dorian Gray, and so it has this weird sort of incongruity where you're not able to ever get fully immersed because you're always kind of living with. You're kind of always expected to be living with and as, but then perceiving Dorian Gray. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of all I wanted to say about Dorian Gray. Let me know what you thought, because that was my feeling. I was very whelmed when I read it. I was like, yep, this is the Dorian Gray that I feel like I already know. So, but yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.